Good evening, everyone. Welcome to this Anglo-Turkish Society event. We are very happy, we are very privileged to be welcoming Professor Brian Rose, who's very generously giving us time from his busy schedule to talk about, I think it's fair to say, a project close to your heart, Brian. You've been involved in this for quite a goodly number of years. So Professor Rose, he's an American archaeologist, a classical scholar, and an author. He's professor of archaeology at University of Pennsylvania in classical studies. He's involved in, a million and one things. He was the curator in charge of the Mediterranean section of the Penn Museum and was the museum's deputy director from '08 to 2011. He's been president of the Archaeological Institute of America and currently, most pertinently to tonight's talk, he is director for the Gordion excavations and head of the post-Bronze Age excavations at Troy. Between 2003 and 2007, he directed the Granicus River Valley Survey Project, which had a focus on recording and mapping Greco-Persian tombs that dominate northwestern Turkey. As I say, tonight we are here to hear about Troy and Gordion. I believe some very excellent news for the site in 2003, being added to the UNESCO Heritage Site list, which I'm sure is something that we will hear a bit more about and we'll be very excited to hear about. It's a great achievement. So without much further ado, Brian, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you. I will set up the screen sharing. Okay, is that visible to everyone?
That's coming through just fine.
During the last 35 years, I've had the good fortune to direct or co-direct excavations at two legendary sites in Turkey, Troy and Gordion. Recently, while I was completing the first volume of the Troy final publications, I faced the task of presenting my own research in historiographic perspective while attempting to maintain as much objectivity as possible. This talk is an extension of that exercise. I've tried to highlight the positive and negative aspects of both Troy and Gordion in as much detail as possible, with a focus on the extent to which regional, national, and global developments have shaped our research agendas. I'll also include some broader thoughts on the discipline of archaeology in Turkey and the Near East at the end of this talk, since the field has changed so radically in the last decades. At first glance, Troy and Gordion have many points of similarity. Both are multi-period sites in Anatolia with habitation spanning nearly 4 millennia, from the 3rd millennium BC to the Seljuk and Byzantine periods. And both consist of monumental citadels with surrounding burial mounds or tumuli. Both sites had also been excavated for decades by the time I assumed responsibility for fieldwork. The techniques of excavation and conservation have changed dramatically during the course of exploration of these two sites, and one can read those changes to an extent in the current appearance of the ruins. What might not be as readily apparent are the ways in which the history of the excavation has affected the strategies behind the presentation of the sites, and the extent to which contemporary fieldwork has been and continues to be affected by politics. Hovering in the background at all times, at least at these two sites, are the legendary figures that have consistently been tied to them: Homer for Troy and Midas for Gordion. The discussion should begin with Troy, which is in many respects the more complex site in terms of archaeology and politics. Troy has been the focus of one controversy or another since antiquity, primarily because its name refers to both the site and its legends, which have consistently been joined together. The site's geographic location was distinctively advantageous in that it lay at the mouth of the Dardanelles or Hellespont, which served as one of the easiest crossing points between continental Europe and Asia. As a consequence, Troy was continually a locus of conflict between powers that lay at both east and west, and the site gradually acquired a kind of dual identity that has continued in a way to the present day. Between 1855 and 2012, during a period of over 150 years, there have been three major campaigns of excavation at the site. Those of Heinrich Schliemann and Wilhelm Dürpfeld, Carl Blagan from the University of Cincinnati in upper right, and Manfred Korfmann, Ernst Pernitzka, and me, representing the universities of Cincinnati, Tübingen, and Penn, all together. The critics of Schliemann's publications were vociferous in their objections to his interpretations, and divergent opinions about Troy's significance have surrounded every field project that's explored the site, including the most recent one. If I had to choose a single defining feature of the Schliemann excavations, it would be the discovery of the treasure of Priam in 1873. This was one of several assemblages of gold, silver, bronze, and lapis objects, primarily vessels and jewelry, that Schliemann connected to Troy's legendary king Priam. And even though he recognized before the end of his life that the treasures dated 1,000 years earlier than the period of conflict between Mycenaean Greeks and Anatolians, the Homeric foundations of the site of Troy were anchored in place at that time. Schliemann's search for a stratum that could be identified as Homer's Troy resulted in the destruction of an extensive amount of material in the center of the citadel, since he initially targeted the early Bronze Age or Troy II levels as most likely to prove the historicity of the Trojan War. Many other archaeologists have made the same error in their decision to showcase one particular level of occupation in a multi-period site by removing the remains of later habitation, with the site of Gordion furnishing another case in point. At Troy, Schliemann documented little of what he removed. As such, the center of the citadel, at least the remains later than the third millennium, are completely unknown, as you can see from this color phase plan of the 9 Trojan settlements. Nearly 40 years would pass until the next campaign of excavations, led by Carl Blagan of the University of Cincinnati between 1932 and 1938. Blagan's campaign had 2 principal objectives: to examine the stratigraphy of the Citadel Mound and to search for Bronze Age cemeteries, a search that still continues in spite of dramatic advances in remote sensing. There's no evidence to indicate that Troy and its excavations played any significant role in Turkish political discourse during the period of Blagan's campaign, which one might also have expected given the growing prominence of Troy in Turkish national identity at that time. It's difficult to pinpoint exactly when the story of the Trojan origins of the Turks began. It may go as far back as the 7th century AD, but it was certainly in place by the 12th century and was continually reinforced in the following centuries. When Mehmet II traveled to Troy in 1462, he reportedly stated that he had finally avenged the attacks on the city of his kinsmen, the Trojans, by sacking Constantinople, the capital city of the Greeks, 9 years earlier. After the Turkish victory at the Battle of Gallipoli in 1915, Mustafa Kemal Ataturk allegedly called out to Hector that his death had finally been avenged. Nevertheless, there were no celebrated visits by Ataturk to Troy during Blagan's campaign, in spite of Ataturk's interest in formulating a new Anatolian identity that involved Hittites, Trojans, and Turks. Blagan ended his excavations at Troy in 1938, in part because, as he notes in his final excavation report, a significant amount of material should be left for the next generation of archaeologists, who would have access to archaeological tools and techniques far superior to what existed in 1938. The other reason, without question, was that he hoped to complement the results of his fieldwork at Troy with the excavation of a Mycenaean palace in Greece, namely at Pylos, thereby, in a sense, following the model of Schliemann, who had undertaken fieldwork at both Troy and Mycenae. In terms of actual fieldwork, there was a hiatus between the end of the Blagan campaign in 1938 and the beginning of a new program of excavations in 1988, which were directed by Manfred Korfmann of the University of Tübingen in partnership with the University of Cincinnati, where I was then teaching and where I assumed responsibility for the post-Bronze Age excavations and research, or PBA as we called it. This new partnership was constructed in essence by Machteld Melink of Bryn Mawr College and Getzel Cohen of Cincinnati. The new team was intended to be multinational, with German, American, and Turkish scholars working side by side as the primary stakeholders, and with a research program that accorded equal value to all phases of habitation at the site, from Neolithic through late Byzantine. As a signal of that expanded agenda, we began work on a version of Wilhelm Dörpfeld's color phase plan intended to unite graphically the results of Schliemann, Dörpfeld, and Blegen for the first time. We also agreed that we would commit up to 15 years to fieldwork, but no more. We would excavate only as much as was absolutely necessary to answer our principal questions about settlement patterns, with the expectation that future generations of archaeologists would have access to tools and techniques far superior to anything we could deploy. The system of trench sharing that we designed was somewhat unusual. In the areas that fell within the post-Bronze Age research program, the idea was that we would dig down to the earliest post-Bronze Age levels, after which the trench would be transferred to the Bronze Age team. When Korfmann and I designed the trench sharing agreement, we assumed that the division would be easy to determine. In most areas, the earlier excavators had found no levels earlier than Archaic, no post-Bronze Age levels earlier than Archaic, and in many trenches, there were no strata between early Hellenistic and late Bronze Age. Nevertheless, the evidence that we uncovered in several major trenches showed that there was less of a gulf between Bronze Age and post-Bronze Age than we had expected, and in some areas, less than a century. One can find several indications of the uncertainty as to who was responsible for the early Iron Age pottery if one peruses the volumes of Studia Troica, our site publication, especially those that were published during the excavation of the West Sanctuary. I considered those ceramics, in other words, those of early Iron Age date, to be within the post-Bronze Age sphere and labeled them as 8A1. Korfmann, however, regarded them as Bronze Age and referred to them as 7B3 to reinforce their Bronze Age position. In other words, the proto-geometric period had become the focus of a kind of tug of war between us, and it highlighted for me the perils of dividing a site in two. I would later witness a similar problematic division at Gordion. Requiring immediate attention were the steadily disintegrating ruins of the site, especially the late Bronze Age fortification wall, which tourists routinely climb in imitation of the Homeric heroes, especially following Hollywood films about Troy. Our conservation strategy was as follows. New blocks added to a wall as infill would correspond to the shape and dimensions of the original stones. Yet those new blocks would be composed of smaller stones so that they could easily be identified as modern interventions. This conservation philosophy conformed fully with that of the 1964 Charter of Venice, wherein modern interventions need to be easily distinguishable from the original masonry, yet without detracting from the aesthetic integrity of the original building or structure being conserved. One of the reasons why we were so focused on the rescue of deteriorating ancient structures was because the first Gulf War had just occurred, and so much material culture in both Iraq and Kuwait had been destroyed. Both of us were deeply affected by this destruction, especially Manfred, whose childhood had coincided with the end of World War II. One intervention, in a sense, took us back to the beginning of Schliemann's excavations. This involved a mud brick megaron of early Bronze Age date in quadrant G6, next to the latest Troy II gate leading into the citadel. The excavation began in 1998, in part because external financial support for the project was beginning to decrease, and there was a hope that the excavation of another Troy II or early Bronze Age megaron would yield an assemblage similar to the treasures that Schliemann had found. Although the discoveries from that excavation were by no means insignificant, the primary discovery was an intact megaron, the mud brick walls of which needed to be protected. The original walls were subsequently faced with modern mud brick, and a large curved sail-like canopy was erected above it as protection against rain and snow. This is one of the rare cases in which the conservation intervention contains its own iconography, in that the canopy was intended to highlight the importance of wind in the ancient commerce of Troy, and was positioned to evoke the height and shape of the mound as it existed when Schliemann first began to excavate there. One of the byproducts of our increased archaeological activity at Troy was a rise in the attention paid to the Homeric legends that had been attached to this area since antiquity. A particularly prominent component of the new activities was an annual spectacle, generally referred to as the Troy Festival, during which a Judgment of Paris contest was staged on Mount Ida, where the original contest had allegedly occurred, and still, as you see on lower right, with the golden apple as the prize, albeit now made of paper mache. The Homeric associations of the Troad received even greater attention in 1993, when Schliemann's Treasure of Priam, believed to have been destroyed in Berlin at the end of World War II, appeared unexpectedly in the depots of Moscow's Pushkin Museum. There was no attempt to tie the legends of Homeric Troy to any of the new discoveries at the site, at least at the beginning of the project, nor does one find any mention of legendary epics in the initial archaeological reports that we produced. In 1993, however, one new discovery tied to remote sensing would bring both the Iliad and Atlantis into the discussion of Troy's archaeology in a way that could not have been anticipated. At the southern end of the lower city, magnetic prospection during the 1992 season had detected anomalies that were considered possible indications of a second Bronze Age fortification wall. Excavation during the following year yielded a rock-cut ditch, ostensibly intended as a fortification component, which demonstrated that the Bronze Age lower city was considerably larger than we had expected. A second, slightly later ditch to the south of the first one was discovered in 1995, and it initially looked as if both ditches had completely encircled the lower city. The existence of such a defensive ditch in the lower town or outer residential district was by no means unprecedented. Similar ditches of late Bronze and Iron Age date have been unearthed at sites in Turkey, Syria, and Israel, among others. But this was Troy, where defensive systems have consistently been placed in the shadow of the Iliad, and several unusual interpretations began to appear. In 1992, Eberhard Zonger had published a book entitled Flood from Heaven, Deciphering the Atlantis Legend, in which he identified Troy as the source of the Atlantis story. Atlantis, of course, was reportedly encircled by canals, and Zonger quickly interpreted the newly discovered ditches as two of those canals, thereby fortifying the link between Troy and Atlantis that he had been trying to establish. Most members of the staff accepted this as yet another highly unusual interpretation of Homeric Troy, but Korfmann was deeply troubled by it, and two refutations quickly appeared in our annual excavation journal, Studia Troica. Zonger responded with a new broad-based analysis at the end of the Bronze Age, which included an epilogue critiquing Korfmann's excavation strategy and interpretation of the size of the Bronze Age lower city. Discussions of Atlantis and Plato therefore became regular components of our conversations at Troy for the remainder of the 1990s, and Zonger's theories demonstrated the malleability of the site for scholarly purposes. At nearly the same time, the newly discovered ditches began to be discussed in connection with the defensive ditch mentioned in Iliad Book 7 that reportedly surrounded the Greek camp during the Trojan War. And the relevant passages in the Iliad were cited in two articles appearing in the 1995 and 1998 volumes of Studia Troica. Shortly thereafter, a bronze seal inscribed in Luwian script was found in a house dated to the 12th century BC, which represented the first writing of Bronze Age date to have been unearthed at Troy. In retrospect, this was the beginning of a period in which we were criticized for allowing the Homeric tradition to play too prominent a role in our fieldwork and research. The discovery of the seal prompted Korfmann to look more closely at potential links between Troy and the Hittite kingdom, where Luwian was one of the primary languages, and new advances in Hittite geography at the same time made it possible to link Troy with the Hittite vassal state of Wilusa, which is mentioned several times in texts recovered from the Hittite capital of Boazkoi. By 2000, the annual excavation report was entitled Excavations at Troy, Wilusa, and a large marble Ilios Wilusa sign was erected at the entrance to the site, although without explanation, so the average visitor was and continues to be confused. One of the Boazkoi tablets, dating to the early 13th century BC, records a treaty between the Hittite king Muwatalli II and the Wilusan ruler Alexandru, here on the left. And since Alexandru is the Hittite version of Alexandros, the alternate name for Paris in the Iliad, the reference has been interpreted as Paris, ruler of Troy. An earlier tablet referred to the Achaean commander Atarisia, usually regarded as the Hittite name for Atreus, who attacked Western Asia Minor with 100 chariots in the 14th century. A third one, the so-called Tawagalawa letter, here on the right, was written by a Hittite king to his Achaean counterpart, a now famous phrase about the matter of Wilusa, concerning which he and I, that's to say the rulers of the Hittites and the Mycenaean Greeks, were hostile to one another. This has been viewed as a kind of Homeric smoking gun, the conclusive evidence for a war between Greeks and Anatolians at Troy that so many had sought. And it brought the Iliad and the archaeological site of Troy even more closely together. I should note that we have no evidence at Troy for a destruction level dating to that period, although there is one from the early 12th century with blackened arrowheads and sling stones. Another Hittite text, dating only a few decades earlier than this destruction level, informs us that the king of Wilusa had been deposed and had sought Hittite protection. So we see a very complex military framework on either side of 1200 BC, with both foreign and domestic strife well attested. All of these discoveries are relevant to the controversy surrounding the 2001 exhibit in Germany that focused on the past and present Troy excavations, entitled Troja Traum und Wirklichkeit, Dream and Reality. Included in the exhibit, as well as the catalog, was a hypothetical axonometric reconstruction of Troy's lower city during the late Bronze Age, which you see here on the right, showing the district as densely inhabited. Our evidence for this reconstruction was limited since we had excavated less than 2% of the lower city, and a surface survey of the area had not yet taken place. But it was presented as conjectural, and no one at the time considered that it would become as controversial as it subsequently did. The leader of the critics was Korfmann's Tübingen colleague, Frank Kolb, who pointed out that the evidence for such dense occupation in the late Bronze Age was absent, as was the proof that Troy was a major mercantile center at that time. Some of his arguments picked up on the criticisms made by Zonger in 1994, and the dispute developed into a kind of intellectual war, with scholars lining up on either side of a Kolb-Korfmann line. The debate dominated conversations in Troy between 2001 and 2005, and the central event of that period was a conference in Tübingen in February of 2002, at which both groups presented their arguments for and against Troy's importance in the late Bronze Age. to an assembled audience of 800 and a live broadcast on German public radio, which was marketed again as a new Trojan War. At Troy itself, there was a visual byproduct of this debate, although it would not have been apparent to most viewers. One of the major disputes between Kolb and Korfmann had focused on Troy's role as a trading center during the Late Bronze Age. Korfmann had argued that the strong winds of the Dardanelles had prompted ships to seek safe harbor in the vicinity of Troy, which in turn was one of the causes of the settlement's prosperity. Kolb had disputed this while casting doubt on the existence of an Aegean Black Sea traffic during the Late Bronze Age. In 2001, new site banners were created with the phrase, "The wind brought wealth to Troy," framed by a drawing of the Luvian seal that we had discovered. This phrase was translated into 4 languages and erected on flagpoles that line the main entrance to the site. In 2002, after 15 seasons of fieldwork, I ceased excavation, as Korfmann and I had agreed at the beginning of the project. But Korfmann was reluctant to stop because, as he said at the time, only continued excavation in the lower city could prove that Frank Kolb's criticisms were unfounded. During this same period, Süleyman Demirel, the president of Turkey, paid a visit to Troy and stressed the importance of the site for Turkey and for its relations to Europe. It was in 1999 that Turkey was recognized as a candidate for full membership in the European Union, and some argued at that time that Turkey should be accepted into the EU since it is the home of Troy, which is inextricably connected to the foundations of European culture. This makes a fascinating pendant to Rome's claims of Trojan ancestry and antiquity, and it raises again the issue of links between ancient Troy and modern Turkey, and especially between the Battle of Gallipoli and the Trojan War. Ataturk's alleged comment at the former battle about avenging Hector has already been mentioned, and several of the British soldiers who fought in that war viewed it as a second Trojan War, reading the Iliad on their way to Gallipoli and writing of Achilles in the poetry they composed. Another poem of 1919 has the fallen fighters speaking of their legendary counterparts, as if the soldiers of Troy and Gallipoli were now bound by ties of kinship. As one travels through the Dardanelles today, approaching the narrowest point between Europe and Asia, there are 2 powerful reminders that these 2 wars between East and West have consistently been linked. On the Asian side, in the city of Çanakkale, is the colossal wooden horse that had been used in the 2004 film Troy, standing as an obvious reminder of the area's connection to the wars of antiquity. Directly across the straits is one of the most prominent of the Gallipoli war memorials, with a striding soldier pointing toward a monumental inscription. "Stop, traveler. The soil you tread once witnessed the end of an era." That sentence could be applied as well to several of the wars that were waged in and around Troy in antiquity. And it's noteworthy that the Troy citadel served as one of the Gallipoli lookout stations for Turkish soldiers, whose shells are occasionally found there. During the course of the excavation, the contemporary battles in the Middle East were a continual subject of discussion. Certainly, Troy and the Trojan War have come to occupy an increasingly prominent role in discussions of modern conflict. One can easily point to the books Achilles in Vietnam, Ajax in Iraq, or Odysseus in America as cases in point, or to the theater of war workshops, wherein performances of Sophocles' Ajax are tied to discussion of post-traumatic stress experienced by modern veterans. This raises the question as to whether contemporary politics played a role in our archaeological analysis. I can think of only one related to my publications of the Polyxena sarcophagus, which dates to around 500 BC and was discovered in a tumulus in the Granicus River Valley, not far from Troy. The front, which you see at the bottom of the slide, is dominated by a scene at the end of the Trojan War, wherein Neoptolemus sacrifices Polyxena to the deceased Achilles, represented by the burial mound at the right. After the advent of the war in Iraq in 2003, I began to view and write about the sarcophagus differently, in that I realized that the carvers would have been designing and completing the scene of Polyxena's sacrifice while the Persian wars were being waged around them. I wondered whether the iconography of that scene was influenced by the sculptor's experience in their own war between East and West, and I incorporated such links in my analysis. To an extent, I suppose I had wrapped three East-West wars around that sarcophagus: Greeks versus Trojans, Greeks versus Persians, and the US versus Iraq. One of the most intriguing traits of the archaeologists who have conducted fieldwork at Troy is that they consequently assumed the direction of other large sites that were intended to complement the information they acquired while digging at Troy. The first three archaeologists, Schliemann, Dürpfeld, and Blegen, moved to the Mycenaean palaces of Mycenae, Tiryns, and Pylos, respectively, which enabled them to examine late Bronze Age habitation on both sides of the Aegean. Manfred Korfmann, as I mentioned above, believed that Troy's wealth in the late Bronze Age was virtually related to its ability to provide safe harbor for ships sailing between the Aegean and the Black Sea. Such a thesis, however, rests on the assumption that the Black Sea was open to Aegean maritime traffic during the Bronze Age, and there is currently insufficient evidence for such shipping prior to the 8th century BC. As a consequence, Korfmann realized that a broader geographical sphere of inquiry was necessary and turned his attention toward the eastern Black Sea coast, launching excavations at two sites in Georgia, Didigora and Udapno, in an effort to unearth proof of Aegean traders there. This objective was ultimately not met, but Korfmann never abandoned his convictions that Mycenaean boats bound for the Black Sea had sought safe harbor at Troy, and his publication of the results from the Georgia excavations in Studia Troica made it seem as if there were a connection. In my case, I moved to another multi-period citadel site in Turkey, that of Gordion, which also enjoyed a strong connection with legendary and heroic figures, especially Midas and Alexander. As the capital of the Phrygian kingdom, Gordion controlled much of Central Asia Minor during the Iron Age, and like Troy, the site appears to have received a sizable group of immigrants from southeastern Europe in the 12th century BC. The settlers who came to Troy probably crossed via the Dardanelles, while those who arrived at Gordion probably traveled across the Bosphorus. The two sites therefore seemed complementary in many ways, especially in terms of time. Troy appears to have been wealthy in the late Bronze Age, but relatively impoverished in the Iron Age, and the reverse was true for Gordion. The citadel of Gordion measures about 450 by 300 meters, and is therefore nearly four times the size of that of Troy. As at Troy, 9 or 10 sequential settlements comprise Gordion's citadel mound, with a lower city protected by a defensive wall and fortification ditch. Habitation at Gordion begins later than Troy, circa 2300 BC, so the site was inhabited for slightly less than 4 millennia, versus slightly more than 4 millennia at Troy. Both sites are also products of long-term excavation. Fieldwork at Gordion has taken place since 1950, comprising a total of 65 years, while roughly 50 campaigns have occurred thus far at Troy. The first archaeologists who excavated extensively at both Troy and Gordion made strategic decisions about the final appearances of their sites. In other words, which settlements would they choose to showcase, and with what kind of personality would they endow them? Although Schliemann probably gave little thought to this question, the end product of his campaign was the dominance of the early Bronze Age settlement, at least in the center of the Citadel Mound. Rodney Young, the excavator of Gordion between 1950 and 1974, does appear to have given serious thought to this issue and decided to highlight Gordion's early Phrygian settlement between 950 and 800 BC. Much of that settlement had been covered and thus preserved by 5 meters of clay that was laid during a major construction project circa 800 BC, just after a significant fire. And several of the buildings, especially the Citadel Gate, as you see in upper left, were well preserved. Young was able to accomplish his objectives by clearing away most of the structures that dated later than the early Phrygian period, so later than the 9th century BC, although this made it seem as if the citadel had housed only a single settlement rather than 9 of them. And as a consequence, the long history of the site was no longer readily apparent. It has also been noted that archaeologists sometimes exert undue influence on the public presentation of their sites, configuring them as they wished them to have appeared in antiquity. And to an extent, one can view this phenomenon in operation at Gordion as at Troy. Other factors prevented Gordion's citadel mound and its material culture from being viewed synoptically. This relates primarily to a series of decisions made by the sponsoring institution, the Penn Museum, under whose auspices all of the excavations at Gordion have been conducted. Between 1950 and 1973, Rodney Young served as sole director, as did his successor, Keith DeVries, who conducted fieldwork there between 1975 and 1987. Thereafter, however, the Penn Museum split Gordion's directorial responsibilities between 2 archaeologists at different institutions. Ken Sams from Chapel Hill became the overall site director with responsibility for publishing Rodney Young's discoveries, while Mary Voigt of the College of William and Mary was appointed field director with her own excavation team and research strategy. So for the next 25 years of field work, there was a splintering of the accumulated data. Although field reports and articles were regularly published, truly synthetic analyses of the site and its discoveries became increasingly difficult to find, which was not unlike the situation we had created at Troy. Consequently, when I was appointed co-director of Gordion in 2007, my first objective was a color phase plan analogous to that of Troy, which was intended to combine the results of the Young and Voigt excavations, as you see on lower right. The completed plan unites the Phrygian era remains uncovered during the last 65 years and thereby elucidates the changing topography of the citadel over the course of 6 centuries, from the 10th to the 4th century. This has served as the basis for a 3D model of the site that was featured in the recent exhibition on Midas and Gordion at the Penn Museum, which again is rather reminiscent of the scenario surrounding the Troy exhibition 20 years ago, although this time there were fewer conjectural reconstructions. Rodney Young's most monumental undertaking had been his excavation in 1957 of Tumulus MM, the Midas Mound, a 53-meter high burial mound now dated to 740 BC and associated with the father of Midas. Young was initially disinclined to excavate it, in part because of the difficulty of locating the tomb chamber in such an enormous tumulus. But Froelich Rainey, the Penn Museum director, was insistent on another sensational archaeological discovery, analogous to the royal tombs of Ur, discovered through a joint excavation of the British Museum and the Penn Museum. And he believed that the discovery of the Midas Mound tomb would reverberate throughout the world. By drilling in the mound at different points, Young was successful in finding the tomb chamber, which turned out to be the oldest standing wooden structure in the world, although the water used to cool the drills entered the tomb and damaged part of the funerary assemblage. One of the reasons why Rainey and Young were eager for such spectacular discoveries was that they had recently witnessed the end of Partage, the system of sharing archaeological discoveries between the host country and the sponsoring institutions. This meant that none of the Midas Mound objects could be acquired by Penn, nor could any other discoveries. But rather than limit the number of field projects in response to this change, the Penn Museum decided to intensify its fieldwork activity, believing that the increased publicity surrounding the new discoveries would compensate for the absence of the associated objects in the museum's collection. Penn appears to have been very much the outlier here. Many museums ceased their funding of fieldwork following the end of partage, since they could no longer acquire legal title that were excavated. Partage had ended in part due to an increase in nationalism. And that's the topic I'd like to address in the final section of this talk. The last quarter century has witnessed a significant surge in nationalism, especially in the wake of the collapse of the Soviet Union, the concomitant changes in the governments of Eastern Europe, and more recently, the chain of revolutions in North Africa and the Near East, commonly referred to as Arab Spring, wherein a new configuration of politics, religion, and ethnic identity has generated an expanding chain of armed conflict. Safety concerns in these zones of war have prompted a sharp decrease in the number of field projects, as well as the destruction of cultural property on an unusually large scale, not yet analogous to what was lost during World War II, but not far from it either. Field projects in Turkey are continuing, but not in the same way they did in the past. We are now more frequently involved in claims for repatriation directed at the museums that support our projects. And we sometimes find ourselves serving as intermediaries between our own universities and the Turkish Ministry of Culture and Tourism. Permission to conduct fieldwork is now sometimes directly linked to those requests for repatriation, and the 1970 UNESCO Convention on Cultural Property Protection is no longer regarded as a fixed principle around which repatriation requests are organized. This was driven home to me 10 years ago when Troy and Gordion became linked in my life in a way I could not have anticipated. In September of 2011, the Penn Museum dealt with a repatriation request by Turkey regarding a collection of early Bronze Age gold that our museum had acquired from the art market in 1966. The assemblage in question consists of 24 pieces of gold jewelry dating to about 2400 BC, which were similar in style and workmanship to those in Schliemann's Treasure of Priam, and therefore commonly referred to as the Troy gold in the Penn Museum. In the initial publications, written in the late 1960s, by George Bass, then a curator at the Penn Museum, he highlighted the difficulty of pinpointing the provenance of the jewelry and was not convinced that all the objects were from the same site. He noted their strong similarities to the early Bronze Age jewelry of Troy in northwest Turkey, Poliokni on Lemnos, and Ur in southern Iraq. The Penn Museum's Troy gold was subsequently published and exhibited in a variety of books and journals, especially after the rediscovery in 1993 of Schliemann's Treasure of Priam in Moscow. Despite the increased publicity for all things Trojan at that time, there were no claims for the repatriation of Penn's Gold of Troy. In 2009, however, I brought two archaeometallurgists from Germany to examine the gold. A few particles of soil were found lodged inside one of the gold pendants, and neutron activation analysis revealed that the composition of the soil in the Penn Museum gold was consistent with the soil in the plains of Troy. Ernst Pernitzka, the lead scientist, and my former colleague at Troy, said that it was not proof of provenance, but it was a good bet that Penn's Trojan collection had come from somewhere in the region of Trojan influence, Turkey, Greece, or southeastern Europe. Toward the end of 2011, the Turkish Ministry of Culture and Tourism contacted the Penn Museum regarding the potential transfer of the gold to Turkey, based in large part on Pernichka's scientific analysis. That request was both clear and firm. If we did not repatriate the gold, Penn would no longer be granted permission to work in Turkey again in any capacity. So Penn's expedition to Gordion would end. All of this happened shortly after Turkey had made a similar request to Germany regarding the repatriation of a Hittite sphinx from Boğazköy that had traveled to Berlin's Pergamon Museum in 1926. Turkey claimed that it traveled only for conservation. The Germans claimed it was a gift. Either way, Germany was told that they would lose the right to conduct research in Turkey if the Sphinx were not repatriated, and it was sent back. A series of discussions took place between Penn and the Turkish Ministry of Culture and Tourism over the course of the next 11 months, from September of 2011 through August of 2012, in which I was the chief negotiator. When the discussions began, we pointed out that the gold had been purchased 4 years before the UNESCO convention had been formulated, and the officials from the ministry indicated that they were now following the Ottoman Antiquities Law of 1906 and compared their claim to the Troy gold to the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act in the US. The museum director, the Penn Museum director at that time, Richard Hodges, initially proposed a 30-year loan, which was rejected by the ministry. Shortly thereafter, we proposed an indefinite, which was the farthest the university was willing to go, since the precise provenance of the gold could not be established with 100% certainty. This too was initially declined, but then finally accepted by the Turkish ministry in April of 2012. What this meant was that the Troy gold would go indefinitely to Ankara and then to Troy for the new museum there, as it has. In return, the ministry promised strong support for the continuation of Penn's excavations at Gordion for as long as we like. Also promised was the loan to Penn of the assemblage from Gordion's Midas Mound for an exhibit of 1 year's duration. This exhibit, entitled The Golden Age of King Midas, opened at the Penn Museum 7 years ago. As a result of this experience, I realized that strategic plans and research agendas for excavations need to be configured differently so that a publication can still be produced, even if the permit for a site is abruptly canceled. The other reason for an unusually flexible research plan is that more and more of us now form collaborative ventures with archaeologists who are based in the host country, and one often needs to modify one's fieldwork so that it will be compatible with that of the local partner. It's relatively easy to view a site in long-term perspective and to place the associated activities and achievements in historiographic context, but it's far more difficult to predict what those sites will look like after another quarter century has passed. At sites such as Troy and Gordion, the legends associated with Homer and Midas will surely continue to be linked in some way to the fieldwork there, and as such, controversies involving archaeological interpretation will undoubtedly occur. I think it's unlikely that these two sites and their associated museums will be affected by the current political turmoil in the Near East. And if that holds true, the sites will be all the more valuable since the ancient material culture of the surrounding countries will have been so seriously damaged. Moreover, since so many Near Eastern countries will be considered too potentially dangerous for fieldwork, the number of archaeologists who choose to specialize in this region of the world may eventually decrease, even though the number of graduate applications in ancient Near Eastern archaeology and history has risen dramatically since the beginning of the Iraq War in 2003, at least at my university. These are times of transition, with the archaeological community gradually recognizing that the codes of conduct that have been in place for a century can no longer prevail in the countries in which we work or the world in which we live. For the student of archaeology today, then, the development of skills in diplomacy and creativity is just as important as those in archaeological techniques. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Brian. I invite everyone to unmute your microphones at the very least and offer our speaker a round of applause of thanks, or use your little clapping emoji. Now we have some time for questions, so if you would like to ask a question, if you could either use the raise hand function on Zoom, and then I will invite you to unmute yourself, switch on your camera, and ask your question. If you would prefer, you can write your questions into the chat box, and I will relay them to Brian that way. So, any questions before I'm gonna... Oh, Colin, yes, I see a hand up there. Yeah, go ahead.
Professor Rose, that was absolutely magnificent. As someone as a student who dug in Turkey in 1970 at a prehistoric site, I found it absolutely riveting, and I've been an archaeological publisher for 4 decades. Could you just give us an idea of the population or size at its maximum of Troy, first of all, and Gordion? And then I'm also, as a tangential minor question, fascinated that Mehmet II, you say, went to Troy before in the West it had been identified as that location.
Well, okay, those are 2 good questions. For the population, we can only guess because the residential districts at both sites have only been barely touched. So as I mentioned, we've excavated slightly less than 2% of the residential district at Troy. We have a rough idea of the population in the period of Roman occupation. That would have been around 10,000 in Troy and the surrounding area. I'm just not sure. Around 10,000 for Troy and the surrounding area. So there were a number of regions that were settled in the surrounding area, and it was very densely occupied at that point, as we know from remote sensing. But for the Bronze Age, I can't really estimate it. Remote sensing cannot tell us how many houses there were in the residential district from the late Bronze Age, because built over those houses are the Greek houses and the Roman houses. And so it just looks like mush when you look at the remote sensing results. And unfortunately, the same is true for Gordion. We don't have good magnetic perspection readings or radar readings for the residential districts. So I can't easily make a population guess for Gordion. I would like to think that in 10 more years I could, but at the moment, it's difficult to do so. We only last summer found an entirely new residential district on the east side of the settlement. So I can say it's twice as large as I thought it was, but I never gave that a number to begin with. So the site is growing gradually as our research continues. Sorry, what was the second question?
Mehmet II's visit.
Mehmet II, yes. So Mehmet II reportedly went to Troy in 1462, so 9 years after he sacked Constantinople, and made this speech about the Trojans being his kinsmen. Now, did he go to the site that we now identify as Troy? That's harder to say, because many of the visitors to Troy in the late medieval and early modern periods describe what they saw at Troy when they made their visits. And what they saw were the ruins of Alexandria Troas, which is a 45-minute drive to the south of Troy. So it's conceivable that Mehmet II went to Alexandria Troas, where there are some very imposing ruins that look like a major ancient city, as of course it was, thought that he was at Troy, and gave his speech there. So he surely was in the right area, but maybe not in exactly the right spot.
Thank you.
Thank you, Colin. Any more questions? hands raised in the room? If not, I'll toss a couple at our speaker then. Yes, Brian, thank you. That was just, I don't know if anyone else is reeling because of the amount of information they've just received, but definitely a lot to think about. I was particularly interested, I did mention at the start your great achievement of having Gordion added to the UNESCO heritage site list. As someone who's sort of had a peek behind the curtain, could you maybe tell us a little bit about what that process sort of entails? And I think I can imagine with the wealth of material at Gordion and maybe being a multi-period site was something that definitely went very strongly into the application. But could you maybe talk a little bit about that process?
Yeah, I did it twice actually, because Troy is also a UNESCO World Heritage Site. So
Oof.
that wasn't as complex. That we did in the mid 1990s. And I remember that as not being as overwhelming as it was when we did it in the last few years for Gordion. Our biggest obstacle when we did it for Troy was that it meant that the beach areas next to Troy on the Aegean would be protected and would be brought into a national park. That meant that the developers could not build hotels and restaurants there. So the push then was a local push against inscription because it would have had an effect on the touristic development of the region. In the case of Gordion, that application ended up being 400 pages, and it was unlike anything I've ever done. We had to compare Gordion to every other sort of similar ancient site in the world. We had to prove not only that Gordion was of incredible importance in the region and in Turkey, but also across the globe, universal global significance. That's what you have to prove. So they wanted me to compare the 130 tumuli at Gordion with those in Central America and in Siberia, which I hadn't really thought of doing. I mean, gradually I got the hang of it. It really is a global focus. And so that's one of the reasons why you need to write so many pages. Once you finish the application, then a team of experts come in. This was 2021. There were 15. It was like taking my doctoral exams again, although harder, because the questions were in areas I couldn't have predicted. So what had I done at the site to accommodate visitors who were blind? I wasn't ready for that one. What about visitors who were in wheelchairs? How were they going to be able to navigate the site? And I have to say, when they first asked it, I thought, well, it's an archaeological site. There's no way you can make an archaeological site handicapped accessible. And then I realized you can make anything handicapped accessible if you work hard enough at it. And so we are now doing that. But there were a number of such questions. If we were going to be successful at outreach, we had to consider all the ways in which the site needed to be modified to reach out to as many different types of people as possible. We were scheduled to be voted on as a UNESCO World Heritage Site in 2022, but with UNESCO for the World Heritage Committee, there's a new chair every year, and whoever the chair is, they get the chance to dictate where the UNESCO meeting will take place, at which the sites will be considered for inscription on the list. In 2022, the chair was Russian. He wanted UNESCO to meet in Russia. UNESCO said to him, we will not meet in Russia. You've just started a war in Ukraine, many cities of which are UNESCO World Heritage Sites. So we will not go to Russia. And he said, I will not do this on Zoom. If you won't come to Russia, there will be no meeting this year. And so there wasn't. So then in September, the current chair is Saudi Arabian. And so we went to Riyadh, which was the city he picked. And there were 2 years worth of sites considered, 2022 and 2023. At the beginning of the meeting, the Ukrainian representatives passed around maps of Odessa, a UNESCO World Heritage Site with the sites of Russian bombings marked on the plan. So it was clearly a very political discussion. Perhaps it always is, but it certainly is when there is armed conflict that is increasing at a steady pace. And so we were fortunate in that no one questioned us. There are 2,000 of you in the same room, and they can question you about different parts of your application. But because so many other countries and sites were controversial, we fortunately sailed through. It was clear that, at least in UNESCO, the world loves Turkey, so we didn't have any trouble.
Oh, that's fascinating. What a huge undertaking. I'm just thinking, you said 400 pages. That is a whole book. I'm wondering, can that count towards your ref contribution? I mean, that's
Yeah.
amazing. I can't believe you found time to do that.
Well,
So
you
if
don't
you're
have a choice, really. I mean, if
no,
you don't have a choice but to do something, then you do it.
that's true. Well, speaking of, you mentioned that your site wasn't very controversial, but you did talk about what can be quite a controversial issue, which is the question of repatriation of artifacts and things like that. And I know from conversations I've had with graduate students, undergraduate students, I think there is people feel differently depending on what the material is that's being repatriated. So we feel differently about, written documentation versus pottery versus, in your case, gold versus human remains have their own feelings about it. Is that something that you ever kind of encountered in your sort of repatriation sort of awareness or work you've done?
It's not black and white. There are many shades of gray in repatriation requests. As president of the Archaeological Institute of America, I always took the side of the countries that had made the repatriation requests, and largely I still do. What was unusual about the repatriation request to the Penn Museum is that I thought, well, this goes against what I was always taught, which is that 1970, the date of the UNESCO convention, was a line in the sand, and any antiquities acquired prior to 1970 would not be requested for repatriation. Those acquired after 1970 would be requested for repatriation. There was a shock when I realized that that line that I believed to be in place no longer existed in the minds of the countries that were filing the repatriation claims. And that makes sense to me as I thought about it. If it's stolen property, it's stolen property. Whether it was stolen before 1970 or after 1970, it's still stolen property. And so, of course, these countries have a right to request it for repatriation. Human remains that's its own special category. We've been dealing with this at Penn in particular. There was a physician in Philadelphia who practiced what we would now call scientific racism. He bought cadavers from cemeteries, especially those of African Americans, to compare the skulls of African Americans with those of Europeans, in an effort to prove that skull shape was tied to intelligence and tied to the races. This, of course, is abhorrent. He donated his collection to the Penn Museum, and we had it until recently. I mean, for a century and a half. Sometimes they were exhibited, these skulls, as an example of scientific racism in the 19th century. But nevertheless, they were part of our collection, accessioned. And the local community finally rebelled against that we had these remains of cadavers that were pulled from the earth where the bodies had been laid in state to prove a point about intelligence and the races. And so that we have just repatriated. It's harder to repatriate such a collection. We because of course it's not a country, it's a cemetery. We, in the end, buried the remains of the bodies in an historically Black cemetery of 19th century date. But you never reach a point where you say, I understand the ins and outs of repatriation, because there's always a new, not just a new twist, but a completely new sphere of repatriation that you wouldn't have known to consider in the past.
No, it is nice to know that, because I taught a session on museums to an art history class I was teaching, and the question of repatriation came up. And I'm sitting there going, I don't know any kind of blanket way or blanket rules for repatriation. So how can I tell these students this is the way it works? So yeah, that's actually really good to know. I do think every case is, as you say, every case is different and judged on its own merit. I do not want to hog our speakers' time. Does anyone else have any questions? Colin, is that a hand up again?
Sorry, I don't want to hog either, but could you just say a bit more about your work at Gordion? First of all, how long, I mean, you're working there every year, presumably, and what's your ambition? And also, what about the techniques you now use? I mean, having been working at Troy and Gordion for so long, and as you said, techniques in the future will improve. I mean, do you use, water sieving, or you presumably have many more specialists than you had 20, 30 years ago?
No, absolutely, we do. I've been working at Gordion since 2007. My goal was to clarify the city plan, which had not been a priority in the past. To do that, we've made extensive use of magnetic prospection, radar, which doesn't work very well in the soil of Gordion, nor did it at Troy, electric resistivity tomography, and especially dendrochronology to refine the dating, because we have in some of our contexts entire timbers that have survived with the bark still in place. So we can use dendrochronology to date the structures precisely. And that was the case with the Midas Mound tumulus, where we were able, with the oldest standing wooden building in the world, where we were able to fix it to 740 BC. But we have a whole variety of, or a whole team of scientists at the excavation. We sieve everything, as does almost every excavation now, possibly every excavation. We do ceramics analysis, petrography, faunal analysis, human skeletal analysis, because of course there are plenty of cemeteries through which we have to dig in order to get to the earlier Phrygian levels. We have several paleobotanists reconstructing the environment. I mean, that's easily half of the team.
Have you found DNA evidence in the human remains?
Yes, and we're working on DNA analysis. That is easier said than done right now. But we excavated a monumental tumulus in 2019. The city gate of the citadel is pointed directly at this tomb. There's a visual dialogue between the tomb and the city gate. It is one of the largest tombs at Gordion. The material inside dates to the 3rd quarter of the 8th century BC. That puts it in the reign of Midas. And so it should be a member of Midas's family. I would love to get the DNA results of that, but first we need the permission of the Ministry of Culture and Tourism to do that analysis. And so we are waiting for that. There's a lot of DNA analysis we would like to do because, of course, our theory, which is bolstered by plenty of archaeological evidence, is that there were migrants that came into the area of Gordion from southeastern Europe, from the Balkans in the 12th century BC. And there are plenty of cemeteries in southeastern Europe of 12th century BC date, and we have some at Gordion, as there are some at Troy. So it would be wonderful to have a combined project that looks at this group of people whom the later Greek historians called the Phrygians, together as part of one scientific project. And that's something I hope that we can do.
But not sea peoples.
Well, the sea peoples, there has been DNA done on some cemeteries that are those of the Philistines, who were named by Ramses III as being among the Sea Peoples, the Peliset or the Philistines. The DNA in those graves, in the done on the DNA in the bodies of those graves, points toward Crete and Sardinia as point of origin, which are among those names that are included in Ramses III's list of the Sea Peoples. So there's still a great deal that we're learning about the Sea Peoples through DNA analysis. I can imagine, because the DNA testing of the skeletons at Ashkelon, the Philistine cemetery at Ashkelon in Israel, because that was so successful, vis-a-vis the problem of the Sea Peoples in the 12th century, I can imagine a great deal more of that will be done now.
But not from Anatolia. No evidence for Sea Peoples in Anatolia.
Not based on DNA, but not enough DNA analysis has been done.
Thank you.
Thank you. Well, I'm sure we're going to be looking to wrap up. So just as a nice note to end on, you've kind of hinted a little bit at that, Brian, but what's next for these projects, and where can people find and follow the work and support the projects? How can we do that?
Well, I focus all of my time now on Gordion, where I dig for 3 months every summer. If you were to go onto a search engine and do a search on digital Gordion, that would give you access to our annual newsletters, which we produce every year, in which I try to synthesize all the data from a single excavation season. You can read about our latest discoveries, which include part of a wooden throne of early 6th century BC date, gold and ivory sphinx that probably decorated the top of the throne.
I was reading that this afternoon. It was really fascinating.
In an area that was probably the residence of the rulers of Gordion in the early 6th century, when Phrygia was under Lydian control. So that's the area that we'll continue exploring next summer.
Okay. Thank you very much. I don't think there's any more questions. I think we've all got plenty to chew over. So I will just say thank you again to our speaker.
Question, Gemma?
Oh,
may I ask a quick question, if it's all right?
If the speaker's happy with that, yes, go ahead.
I've got 2 more minutes and then I have to go. Go ahead.
So, first of all and foremost, thank you so much for an absolutely enlightening and fabulous lecture. One of the most important things I think I learned was the amount of politics involved in archaeology. A lot of politics, geopolitics, and that was interesting. I'm not an academic. I have a very simple question. I visited both Gordion and, we went to visit some people on Bozchida, Tenedos, and stayed in a small pension just on the other side of the mainland, and happened to bump into a chap who was the curator of a site there. He showed us a large harbour, and it was getting dark by this time, and he described an area there, which I assume was Troy, which was over 8 square miles of unexcavated city. Now, I'm no way to prove what this was, but that obviously wasn't Troy, because it's just offshore of Bozchida.
Yeah, so you were on the Turkish mainland, right?
Yes. Sorry.
On Bozchida. Yes, that would be Alexandria Troas.
That's what I guessed when you said earlier. I've always been a little confused about exactly where Troy was. And this was a separate city, not a Trojan city.
Right. Well, it was a separate city. It was a flourishing city as of the beginning of the Hellenistic period, late 4th century BC, maintained its importance in the Hellenistic period, and then became a Roman colony under Julius Caesar and Augustus. So it became a kind of sun city for veterans. And since the Romans traced their descent from the Trojans, you could retire in a lovely area that was just down the road from where your ancestors were believed to have come.
That's wonderful. Thank you so much. I really appreciate that. Thank you.
Thank you, Brian. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. I wish you good evening, and do keep your eyes open for forthcoming events from ATS, and any further information from the Gordion project, we'll aim to keep you updated. So thank you very much, everyone, and good evening.